Really, thank you very much to Professor Laura Bechthold for your availability to give us a talk today about futures and democracy. Laura Bechthold is Professor for Technology Assessment and Cultural Management at the Bavarian Foresight Institute. She's a social scientist, really interested in this interaction and dynamics between technology and society. She's really an engaged scholar, really focused on in exploring innovation and how it would impact emerging technologies, but even how we can empower individuals and society at large to really develop future-oriented skills and navigate the uncertainty that we are all living. And that's why we asked her to provide us a really interesting perspective on the futures and democracy. So as we did with Professor Erovara, I kindly ask you to ask to Professor Laura Bechthold any questions that you might have through our poll. And then, as we did before, if anybody would like to just open their mic and ask any question, you are more than welcome to do that. Okay, so without any further ado, I would leave the floor to Professor Laura Bechthold for her keynote speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. I hope that you can understand me all well. And yeah. I will start sharing my screen. And so I have the pleasure now to talk to everybody about futures and democracy, which is not the easiest topic, I guess. And I think you already said quite some things about me, Ilaria, but so I'm a professor at the Bavarian Foresight Institute. We are located north of Munich in Germany. I have a very interdisciplinary background. So I have studied economics, cultural, political science. I have a master in sustainability science. I did a PhD in entrepreneurship and innovation. And now I'm a foresight researcher. So I think with everything what I do, and this is maybe also my key prompt for you at the beginning, I'm trying to integrate a lot of different perspectives because this is what I come from, and try to find ways how to connect different disciplines. And so when I was asked to give this talk about futures and democracy, I was like, okay, this is quite a large topic, but I'm very passionate about it in different ways. And when I thought about how to structure this talk, I thought about, well, what lens even should I take for this? Like, how should we even approach this in a talk like this? And I was thinking about 3 different ways how we could approach this topic. So the first one was, are we talking about futures of democracy in the sense, what kind of political system are we in and heading towards? Are we talking about futures for democracy in the sense, what can foresight or futures research actually tell us, or what can they add to the table when we are looking at democracy? Or are we even talking about democratizing futures in the sense, how do we make sure that our practice as foresight and futures practitioners or researchers sort of adhere to some underlying democratic principles? And I hope that in the next couple of minutes, I can give you a flashlight on each of the 3 perspectives from my perspective. And I'm super happy to also discuss your questions or your perspectives. So let's start with the urgency lens, the futures of democracy. And I want to start with 2 pictures. The first one you might have seen, 1992 in Maastricht. And I will also, I proactively decided to adopt a very European lens for this, because I think this is also the time we are in, where we have to think about our European lens as a European Union. And so I said, okay, let's start with 1992, February 7, the Treaty of the European Union is signed. And then you see another picture down on the left, and this is me in 2005. I was still a high school student, and I was invited to the European Parliament to Strasbourg for a big day for students and for a student meetup, and to also give a speech there as a student representatives. And I have to say, during this day, students from all over Europe came together, and this opened everybody's eyes what we have here with the European Union and what kind of privilege it is to grow up in a European Union like we have. And so the first thought that I then said, okay, well, let's start from this idea of, or this notion of a European miracle. So this is not my wording. This is the wording of a German scholar, Gerald Knaus, who just published a book on the European miracle, in which he and his daughter Francesca define this idea as Europe's transformation from a war-torn continent into a zone of peace, democracy, and prosperity. And it refers to the last approximately 75 years of largely stability, especially in the European Union, where we also have sort of developed a system of reliance so that disputes are resolved in courts, that governments accept judgments, that there's no economic sanctions between us, and especially also that small countries do not necessarily have to fear their larger neighbors, which is basically a historical anomaly. And the question is, can we sort of preserve this miracle? And sometimes also, let's not forget what we have achieved here. And I think we all know that we are now living in different times. Let's start with Justin Trudeau, who famously said at the World Economic Forum in 2018, the pace of change has never been this fast, yet it will never be this slow again. And I think if we look back to the past years, we all agree that our world is changing and sort of in a rupture. Even maybe a disorder. So we have experienced and we are still experiencing quite a lot of different crises, sometimes also converging crises, pandemic all over, but we also have an increase in global conflicts, polarization, etc. And we can name many more here, which also spread uncertainty or where we don't know in which direction this will actually lead. And there are converging events and sometimes maybe even adding up to one another. And sort of the new peak of this global uncertainty, it got on a new level, was when last year, so exactly 1 year ago, at a Munich Security Conference, which is about to start tomorrow again here in Munich, where I'm living, J.D. Vance famously said, okay, what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values. And I think rather than an analysis of the world, this was more an attempt to, on the one hand, to stir up uncertainty and polarization. But above all, it was also to break with this fundamental security paradigm that the US would be, for instance, the reliable partner that we have as Europe and as a democracy. This was emphasized again when I was during the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, just 2 weeks back, and we all heard there was this famous talk about Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, who said the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. And so we are at the brink of maybe a new era. We don't know it yet. This is uncertainty. This is ingrained in foresight and futures. We don't know what the future will bring, but we have a sense of urgency here. Ursula von der Leyen at the same World Economic Forum this year said, the seismic change we are going through today is a necessity to build a new form of European independence. So when we talk about futures and democracy, from my view, this is not an abstract question anymore. It's not a theoretical discussion or a thought experiment that we can run with students in the classroom and then leave the classroom and say, well, you know, nice experiment, but it's very far off. What we are now experiencing is that if we talk about futures of democracy, we are also talking about futures of Europe, and it's a very recent and urgent discussion that we need to have. It's a discussion of also what kind of world do we want to foster and what will we stand up for. This is again from Gerald Knaus's work. Do we want to live in a rules-based order, or like, do we still believe in? Do we want to foster it? Peace as a core value, legal rules that protect the weak, disputes resolved in courts, etc. Or are we entering an hour of the predator, in a sense where peace, we accept that peace is an anomaly or an illusion, and we have to adapt to this. And I think this is a spectrum that we have to critically discuss and that we have to face in today's world. And the question still is, I think we have our European miracle that is worth preserving. And the question that we still should not forget is the overarching goal. It's how can we enable a better future for all? And in my view, future which is better for all is one that needs to be sustainable, because we cannot deplete the It needs to be diverse, it needs to be inclusive to also manage the challenges that are ahead to us. So we need to have new solutions. And of course, it needs to be enabled by technologies, but technologies is for me not the end goal, it's a means to an end. And so the question is, what do we do in this era? What do we do in this era of great uncertainty, of rupture, of tension all over the place? Well, what definitely doesn't work are the strategies of these three animals that you see. Ignorance and just keeping the pace as we did business as usual will not work. Thanatosis will also not work, in the sense we are just dropping dead and trying to sit it out and wait it out will also not work. And hitting the panic mode will also not bring us any further. So we need to have new ideas in that regard. And this brings me to my second part. So when we say the futures of democracy is a question that should be really dear to everybody's heart these days. Now we can discuss, okay, what can actually futures and foresight deliver and add to the table for democracy? And also here, starting from the European lens, we see that, for instance, in the 2025 Foresight report, the European Commission strongly emphasizes the need for foresight. And it strongly emphasizes also the need for what they call resilience 2.0, which is a crucial shift towards proactive and forward-looking resilience to navigate today's unpredictable global landscape. So you see foresight is in here directly written, and this is, I think, where futures and foresight can come in. Then resilience is not just like some kind of infrastructure that we build on the technical side, but it's also like a societal convictions. It's the ability of a society to also know what it needs and why. So we need to find alignment on the new future narrative and see, okay, how we can get there. So we need new narratives for the future. And this is also what have been like, if you browse through media, if you browse through government report, if I'm listening to, and I'm going to a lot of events, panels, etc., there's this call, we need new narratives, we need new pictures of the future, we need a new vision to move towards. And then I always think, yes, I agree with that. But the big question is, where should these new narratives come from? And how can we construct them? And I think this is exactly as well where foresight and futures come in here. And I also want to give you one perspective here. I mean, we could talk about a lot of topics, but one thing that I'm particularly interested in, I think we also needed for all these challenges, is that we must to relearn to think long-term. So what do I mean with long-term thinking? Let's go back again, and I will take you on a small thought experiment now. So imagine it's the year 1882. You are Antoni Gaudí, the Spanish architect, and you have just received the task to build the Sagrada Familia, a new cathedral. And it's an overwhelmingly big task. And you know a lot of things, but you also know about two things in particular. First of all, you will never see the end of your work during your lifetime. You start something that you will never finish. And you also know that there will be a lot of technical challenges on the way, of which you don't have any clue how to solve them yet. But you trust in future generations that they will be managing how to solve these challenges. And so, and I really, what I have started working with in the past year more and more is this idea of cathedral thinking. So the thinking beyond your own lifetime, because I think very often we are very much focusing on the short term, on short-term KPIs. I mean, everybody is under pressure to sort of achieve some KPIs that are given on some higher ups who have KPIs from some higher ups and so forth. But oftentimes we really lack the time and maybe also the dedication to zoom out again and say, okay, in the long run, on the greater scope of things, where do we actually want to move towards? And also here I'm referring to one particular, I want to refer or make one particular person present, actually also an Oxford scholar, Roman Krznaric, who has written this book, The Good Ancestor, about long-term thinking, which I took as an inspiration for starting also working on this topic. Here we are at the conference. And based on this, for instance, I thought, okay, let's try it out at some point. Let's start how we can get there. And so 1 year ago, again, during the World Economic Forum in Davos, I cooperated with a collective, and we gathered 40 people from all kinds of industries, from all kinds of positions, to engage in a workshop on long-term thinking. What you see on the right side is a white paper that came out of that, which is, I think you can still download it. And the task was, okay, let's create this idea of a cathedral together in a metaphorical sense. Where do we want to head in 100 years? So the idea was here not to see, okay, where is AI in 100 years? Where is like this technology? It was not about these kind of things. It was about 9 fundamental areas of life, like human flourishing, like education, like collaboration, and how do we see our world in 100 years? And it was particularly prompted in a way, okay, now we are moving to the positive side of things. And then, because we also had it earlier in the earlier talk, we created, you can see it in the back, this monument, and we started with the top goal, and then we cast it back from there. Okay, if we want to move as a society towards this long-term vision, how can we move back? How can we cast back to today? And how can we sort of create the first brick that we can set in today's world? And the interesting part about this exercise was, and also about the white paper that we also engaged everybody to write with us in, is that the future that we created was full of tensions, trade-offs, and contradictions, and this was okay. So we also called it. It's more like, it's neither a prediction, it's not a utopian future, but it's more a thought provocation. On the other hand, we also found out that we were unified on many overarching aspirations or values. Where I say, okay, we sort of have all a common ground, even if we are from different countries, different industries, different age groups, we sort of are aligned on some fundamental values, how we want to live together. And one of them is, for instance, peace. And so this way we generated these radical pictures of hope, which are really out there to provide an idea of how new narratives can then be used to foster action in a more proactive sense. So I think what we can see here from these examples, also from this exercise, during this exercise, we were able, with the help of futures and foresight methods, to explore really pluralistic models also of our society. So how do we even define democracy? So I'm not mentioning this, but we had one group who was really looking also into new ways of democracy, new ways of government, new ways of how to engage everybody. But I often think this kind of futures and foresight work is a way to help us moving from reactive firefighting to more proactive futures approaches. And more than everything, it's a solid foundation for negotiations about the future. Because if we remember the early work from Pierre Wack, for instance, in foresight, he has written that foresight is also about reperceiving the future together. So just providing some scenarios will not do the job. The spark in foresight and futures is also that you negotiate with one another how your perceptions of the future are, and that you also learn how to negotiate these kind of things and how to build action from this. And with that, I'm moving on to my third part, democratizing futures, or democratizing futures research, future of work. So because we are starting from this very lens, there is, okay, if the future is something that we negotiate together, then the question is, who actually gets a seat at the negotiation table? So who are we including? Who are we excluding? And based on that, do we see the future as sort of a pre-written story, or do we see it more as a landscape that we can create and shape? And I think what we have to see here, and what we also have to critically assess as scholars in foresight and futures, that we are not often ideally giving everybody a place at the negotiation table. So what I mean with that is, and here I'm referring to a paper that I have just published this year with my colleagues and one colleague from Finland. And here we were actually looking at different scenario reports, oftentimes from business practice, one public sector or two public sector reports, and we analyzed the 29 future personas, so the protagonists inherent in the different scenarios. And what we saw there is that, the diversity is also lacking here. So they are representing certain groups of people, which might exclude different perspectives. So in total, we identified 6 different patterns. I just brought 2 of you here. The first one was that all personas almost were representing elitist or rather privileged positions, so people with academic background, with a fairly high income that could also afford and use technologies. And so based on this assessment, we say, okay, we have here a lot of scenario reports which actually envision the future by and for the privileged few. At the same time, almost throughout all scenarios, there was a big overarching trope of technological optimism, in the sense that innovation is the ultimate hero that will save us and that will solve many things. And I think by deriving these narrative patterns, and I think here we can also see, coming back to the narratives that we are constructing, we are also constructing future tropes or future narratives that speak to one particular audience maybe. And I think if we have to think about the democratic future, we also have to enlarge the scope. Another study in a similar direction, and I'm sure you have heard about similar studies in many ways, was a paper that I published last year as well. It was about using AI-generated images for futures work. And here I analyzed 480 different images based also on different prompts. Some included this future, some included futuristic, and see how different professions are depicted. And I exactly saw the same pattern as me and my co-authors saw in the others as well. So it's the representation of certain groups. We have a big gender bias there, speaking on stereotypes. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're obviously male. Ethnicity was overwhelmingly white. If you didn't explicitly prompt it in back then, of course, we have now an iteration of models, so we can talk about timeliness here. But anyway, and of course here also, the moment you put the future in there, it replicated sci-fi tropes. Because of course, the content that the models are trained on is also sci-fi and the futures that are out there. And so also here we have a techno-optimism as well. And I think also here we see that the narratives as we generate them today, and I would say that also images are a way to generate narratives, they also go into a certain direction on the methods way. But so we as scholars, practitioners of foresight futures, we have to find ways also to democratize our own toolbox and our ways of future making. And this is the last example from the same paper. I also think to not leave you with anything without any solution, that also AI can be a great helper here. So this is why my paper is also called a double-edged sword of AI, using AI in for futures. Is because with these kind of co-created images, and if you prompt them well, you have, for instance, a tangible object that you can negotiate. You can have a vision of the long term and say, okay, what do you like? What do you don't like? You can include people much better. It speaks to emotions. People can relate to it. It's oftentimes harder to abstractly formulate what you like or dislike, or what value do you have, instead of pointing to a picture and saying, okay, well, this is why I see it, this is what I doesn't. So I think one way is really to think about how to use AI, because I think it's also one of the hot topics these days, as a side note, how to use AI for foresight and futures, to use it as a tool to open up discussions and to reflect our work that we are doing as foresight and futures researchers and practitioners, and to also democratize our way. So this brings me to the final words. So this was my 3 reflections when I heard about my title, Futures and Democracy. First, it's about our democracy that we are talking about, not an abstract one in the books, and how we see it in the future, that we can deliver quite some value for it as futures and foresight people, in the sense that we can show what kind of future do we want, what do we not want, what's the desirable future, what's the plausible, how can we move between, or how can we elicit this tension, and then how can we move from being reactive to proactive. But in order to do that, I think we also have to see and reflect on ourselves, how can we actually make futures and foresight works inclusive, or in other words, democratize it. And my very last work, why does it matter for business leaders? Because I know that many of you are managers, and this is just my final claim. When we are talking about cathedrals and new cathedrals, you are the ones who have the power to plan, fund, and build the cathedrals of tomorrow. I think business leaders are one of the biggest players in our world, and it's also on you to now put that power to work, and to see how we can move forward. And with that, I'm at the end. Happy to connect. I think this QR code leads to my LinkedIn. Write to me, and I'm happy to engage into discussion now.